Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to day 5 of Teaser season for patch 3.24 and the upcoming Necropolis expansion. Where a number of the previous videos in this series have been things that it wasn't such a big deal to miss, today's is the most important news yet, because while Grinding Gear Games are calling this a number of quality of life changes, this is actually going to be a very, very big balance change as well. And we'll get into that in a sec. But this is going to be a big shake-up to the way that crafting works at the medium to high end in endgame in PathOfExile. There's also several hidden changes in here. For example, Grinding Gear Games are changing the way that resistance flasks work, and they will be better on low investment builds, and they'll end up worse on Pathfinders that have Mage Blood. More on that later, but let's start with the first thing that is just a small change, and that is that the masters will be independent from each other. Currently, if Einhar is in a map, that absolutely prohibits Nico from spawning. That's no longer going to be the case. Now, this is something that is going to have a fairly minimal impact, mostly because you can only really do justice to 1 or maybe 2 or 3 of the masters at a time. And if you are doing justice to 3 of the masters, that's taking up most of your Atlas points, and therefore you're not really getting much else on your maps. Most of the time you're going to want to spec into 0, 1 or 2 of the masters, and probably most often it'll be 0 or 1. That said, this is a buff to the all hands notable on the Atlas, and that's something that I think we should be giving a bit more consideration to in patch 3.24. Some people like it. I don't think it's very strong in the 3.23 game, but it is definitely something that will be better next league than it was this league. It will mean that you'll get more masters, but you'll have less agency over when and where you get them. And with the ability to have multiple at once, that may end up being something that's worthwhile. It's worth noting that Einhar without an Atlas tree dedicated to him is probably only 20% the strength of a real Einhar. Elva is probably only 25-30% the strength of a real Elva if you don't have any of the points allocated on the tree. And Jun may be 40% the strength of a real Jun. So do keep that in mind when you're planning your early Atlas tree for patch 3.24. Let's get to the big thing, and that is the removal of Betrayal's trust-based trades. Now, when we're talking about trust-based trades, what we're talking about here is that you have a crafting bench that I want to use. I then hand over custody of an item that I would like to have that used on. You then go and apply that craft to it. And if I'm lucky and you're not a scammer, you then hand the item back to me and we transfer an agreed fee for it. For example, in patch 3.23, the so-called Ashling Slam, which is probably the most powerful of these trust-based trades other than a mirror service, generally goes for about 10 to 15 divine orbs. In leagues with less inflation than 3.23, it's typically been around 3 to 4 divines. All, or maybe almost all, of the trades in the Betrayal system that required trust no longer exist. Some of these effects are just gone entirely, others of them are being moved to other places. Some of these exist in a tradable but nerfed form. The top one, the Ashling Slam, this one still remains, and it remains at full power. That said, there's a lot of people saying that this is going to mean the end of trade discords like the Forbidden Trove trade discord, which has become a massive part of PathOfExile's economy with literally 500,000 people who've registered as members on it. Whilst the Forbidden Trove trade discord started as a way to manage some of the risks inherent in trust-based trades, and essentially as a place that would ruthlessly purge scammers until it became somewhere that was pretty trustworthy to use, it's kind of evolved over time, and I don't think this is going to have a huge impact on it. All of the trade discords, both TFT and its smaller competitors, have one major advantage over doing trades through the PathOfExile website. As well as handling bulk items better, they also provide you with recourse if your trade's counterparty ends up attempting to scam you. And this means that you are less likely to encounter a scam. It's not that it never happens. I do know people who've been scammed on TFT and also on the other trade discords before, but it's just far, far, far less common. For example, if you're trying to buy a doctor from someone and that person puts in a metalsmith's gift into the trade instead, which looks superficially like the Doctor Divination card, there's no real way for you to deal with that on the main trade website, and that person will be back to listing that fake doctor sale immediately. If it was on TFT, if it was on one of the competing discords, that person would be very, very quickly banned from that site. What this means is that by removing scammers so ruthlessly, these trade discords actually remove a fair bit of the friction that scammers impose on the trade economy in general, and as a result, they end up being a smoother and faster experience. This is still going to be something people need, and for that reason, I think we're still going to see trade discords being dominant in the future of PathOfExile. Anyways, let's talk about what's happening to Ashling Vaals, because there are some big changes here as well as them becoming tradable. So the orb that is currently known as the Veiled Chaos Orb is basically becoming much rarer and having its effect changed. In many ways, it's like it's an entirely new orb. This orb is now going to perform what players term the Ashling Slam. So this is going to remove a random modifier from an item and then add a veiled modifier to it. However, while this is something you currently get by defeating the Syndicate Mastermind while Ashling is allocated to research and is a 3-star general lair, this is changing so that it is going to be an RNG drop instead, and it's going to be an RNG drop from Katarina. We don't know how rare this is going to be, but this is going to be a serious balance change between the current meta, where your best bet is to not just rush Katarina, but also do a little bit of work in order to get Ashling into the right place. It's now going to be best to just fight Katarina as often as possible, unless there's hidden mechanics whereby you need to have a certain number of 3-star generals in order to get the Veiled Chaos Orb to drop, or maybe that increases the chance. All of this is things we're going to have to work out over time. Now, there's no information on what the new Ashling Safehouse rewards are going to be in research, and importantly, the existing Veiled Chaos Orb effect of reforging a rare item with 1 Veiled mod guaranteed, this is gone entirely. This is going to have a huge impact on mid-end crafting, for example, crafting boots with a 4 divine budget, and we'll come back to that later because this is going to be one of the biggest changes in patch 3.24. There's going to be a few critical tests that players are going to have to run, and this is probably going to be run in the first hour that the patch goes live by people in Standard, and that is, how does the Veiled Orb work in conjunction with weird states involving multiple meta mods? For example, if you have multi-mod, prefixes can't change and suffixes can't change on an item, what's going to happen if you attempt to then apply a Veiled Orb to that? My intuition is that it will reject the craft and it will say unable to remove a mod, but I'm absolutely not certain that I am correct there. I also want to pose a bit of a thought experiment here, and this comes down to the fact that the Veiled Orb is now something that can be hoarded, it can be stockpiled, and it can be traded in bulk. I don't have the answer to this, but I just want you to think about this one in the background. How much do you think Hinekora's lock would be worth, one of the most valuable crafting items in the game, if when you got it, you couldn't list it on the trade site and it had to be used inside 24 hours? In short, if Hinekora's lock was given a lot of trade friction that prevented it from being able to be stored up for later use, and that prevented people with deep pockets from being able to buy every single one of them that came onto the market, I suspect it would be much cheaper than it is at present because you wouldn't be able to hoard them. And for this reason, I suspect that all these changes to the Veiled Orb are going to mean that Ashling Slams are going to be much more expensive in patch 3.24 than they have been historically in PathOfExile. Maybe not as expensive as 3.23, that was Inflation League, but if we look at previous leagues before that, they were generally around the 3 to 4 Divine Orbs mark. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up in the 8, 9, 10 Divine Orb range, but we'll have to see. I could be entirely wrong there. Now, another consequence of this is that pre-3.24 crafting videos and guides, including one that I put out just 3.5 days ago, these are basically bricked, a lot of them. All the ones that involve using Veiled Chaos Orbs are in a situation where you can't really use them anymore, or you need to substantially modify them in order to use them. What you should do is, if you find any guide to crafting that you're thinking of using, then be very diligent if it was posted before today's date. Then you should assume there is a reasonable chance that that crafting method has been bricked by these changes, especially because there's a couple of other little changes we'll get to shortly. So let's talk about the Veiled Chaos Orb removal impact in Trade League. So this is not the Ashling Slam. This is the item that was twice as rare as a Divine Orb and dropped anywhere, and that you could also target farm by running Ashling at lower levels in research than 4. This is the orb that had the effect essentially of a Chaos Orb followed by the new Veiled Orb, in that it randomized the mods on the item and then also made one of them veiled. So this is going to be a huge nerf to early progression in the boot slot. The reason for this is that there were 3 excellent boot prefixes that you really wanted to see. And what you used to be able to do was get 3 good suffixes from Rog, and then the item doesn't have any move speed on it. So what you do is you apply a Searing Exarch Ember, I think it is, that then makes an Eldritch Annul guarantee that it'll remove a prefix. You remove a prefix with an Eldritch Annul, you then apply suffixes cannot be changed, and then you apply a Veiled Chaos Orb. When you do this, it's a slight exaggeration to say that you are guaranteed to get move speed, but it's only a really slight one. And that's because it is very common to get one of the 3 options that come up with your Veiled Chaos Orb to be one of the 3 move speed options. This nerf, however, is going to be a gain for some other crafting methods. Eldritch Chaos Orbs, Eldritch Exalted Orbs, and Classic Exalted Orbs, these are all going to be used more on boots than they have been in the past, and they'll probably become the crafting meta for boots in that 3 to 5 Divine Orb range. However, these are much worse at getting move speed than Veiled Chaos Orbs are, and they're also somewhat rarer, at least the Veiled ones are. Classic Exalts are more common than Veiled Chaos Orbs were, but they're also not super common. Also, this change might make Divine Orbs cheaper, especially early in the league, because most people, their first couple of Divine Orbs did go into getting decent boots. Although there's a lot of things that can affect the Divine Orb market. This will also matter in other slots as well, but I did want to call out the boots as the main one. They're the most important slot because they're the one where the Veiled Chaos Orb, as it currently exists, was at its absolute strongest. What about in solo self-found? Again, it's primarily about the boots here, but I do think that we're going to see more people using bench-crafted move speed for a longer period of time in solo self-found than they used to. It's going to impact other slots too, notably the gloves and the helmet, but not as much as the boots because the gap between Metamod Veiled Chaos and Ashling Slam was larger in those slots. Okay, so let's talk about the Jorgin changes. This is not being talked about very much, and that's for a very good reason, because Jorgin's changes only really affect 1 or 2 builds, but they are a really big impact on those builds. So if you're playing a stat stacker that does not use Crystallized Omniscience, the best amulets you could get below about 2 mirrors pretty much all came from talismans, and from starting out their life as a talisman that might have tier 1 strength and tier 1 all attributes on it, and then you attribute quality it, you do a little bit of work on the prefixes, and then you apply Jorgin's Craft to turn it into a tier 3 talisman. Tier 3 talisman had about a 1 in 7 chance to become the attribute talisman, and if you hit that, then it was fantastic. There were also a couple of other cases where you would want to use that talisman craft. For example, the tier 2 version was also of niche use with the Avian Twins talisman, which allows 50% damage shifting from one element into another. This could have some real use cases as well. Anyways, you can no longer target a specific tier. This craft is being removed from the Betrayal system and added into Bestiary, where actually it's probably more of a thematic fit than it was in Betrayal, but it's going to be quite a bit worse than it was. There's no word as to what Jorgin's going to get in its place, and it's also worth noting that this is going to be a buff to synthesized amulets that have percentage increases to attributes. Those numbers are a bit less than the Talisman got. They're generally a bit worse, unless you happen to get a 3 implicit synthesized one that has 2 monstrously good mods on it. They are going to take over as the best option for a stat stacker amulet in the endgame now. It's also a little bit hard to tell for certain, but it looks like that is the Pharric Frost Hellion Alpha beast that's being used to transform an amulet into a talisman. In 3.23, the Pharric Frost Hellion Alpha is used to upgrade a Gilded Scarab to its winged version, and so this is either going to impose a considerable opportunity cost on what used to be known as the Jorgin Talisman upgrade, or alternately, it's going to mean that we're not going to have that Gilded to Winged Scarab upgrade, and that this is going to entirely replace that. All in all, this is a niche craft that's considerably weaker than the 3.23 version was. The next thing that's going away is Overquality benches from Betrayal. These are gone entirely, and this is an indirect delve buff because it makes perfect fossils have more application than they otherwise would. It's also a buff to one of the rare monster conversion mods that people generally didn't care very much about, and this is the one that in the game files is apparently listed as dropped items have 1 to 30 quality, and it does exactly that. It can cause flasks to drop. Something like 1 in 800 items that drop in the game are a flask that is a utility flask, so you're not often going to get one that's got high quality on it, especially that you then need to win the roll where it's in the 21 to 30 range. But these are going to be quite a bit better than they were in patch 3.23. So whilst those rare monster conversions get better, it is mostly those perfect fossils that get better as a result. Flasks, however, can now be Vaaled in order to overquality them. Applying a Vaal orb to a flask is going to provide a modification to the quality, and it seems like it will be anywhere from -10 to +10. I do wonder if this allows you to get 40 quality if you happen to get a 30 quality natural drop, and then you Vaal that to get it up to 40. That's something we'll have to try and test out. Anyways, hidden in Grinding Gear Games' announcement of this, they also provided a little bit of a teaser as to what's happening to some of the resistance flasks. These used to be 20% reduced fire damage taken, and they're being changed to 5% maximum fire resistance. In many ways, this is Grinding Gear Games reversing a change that they made in patch 3.6. In 3.6, they decided to go really limiting on the amount of maximum resistances that players could stack, because there'd been a number of Immortal builds that were able to get 100 resistance to everything. So they imposed the absolute cap of 90% on resistances, and they also went for a number of sources of reasonably easy to acquire maximum resist in the game, and one of them was the Ruby Flask, which used to provide 6% to maximum fire resist. And they came along and they made the change to 20% reduced damage taken. However, this ended up being something that was more powerful than the 6% maximum resistance for a period of time. Not for every player, in fact not for most players, but at the very, very top end of progression, especially when used in conjunction with a Pathfinder that was using Mage Blood and that had a 70% Flask effect in chant and that also had 90% resistances from other sources. This ended up making very, very, very tanky characters at the extreme top end. What Grinding Gear Games are doing here is they are buffing the performance of these flasks on low budget characters and on medium budget characters, keeping them about the same on high budget, and then nerfing them enormously on ultra high budget builds. All in all, I think this is going to be a Pathfinder nerf, a Mage Blood nerf, and a Chieftain buff. Chieftain in particular looks to get a lot out of these because the Ruby Flask is something that you can definitely have a considerable amount of uptime on, and that this is now going to mean that it's much easier to get 90% to all resistances on a Chieftain, which then means you can solve your defenses maybe without needing to invest an aura into Purity of Fire, and that aura can then be used on something else. Whether that be haste, whether that be an offensive aura, whether it be a different defensive aura, or who knows, maybe you still want to have Purity of Fire anyway. Lastly, there's going to be some interesting things to theorycraft around with this and Transcendence. Transcendence is one of those really, really powerful keystones on the passive tree that people should definitely play around with at least once or twice. And in some ways it's getting better, in some ways it's getting worse as a result of this, but it's definitely worth your while thinking about. Anyways, that is everything so far from day 5 of patch 3.24 teaser season. I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal orbs have high quality results.